And take it away, Kim.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 15th event in the 2021 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference, which has a new host institution, the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music at NYU. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbard and Carl Wilson. Last week, we had a wonderful conversation between Helen Reddington, Travis Steimling, and Andrew Flory about labor, agency, and power in the recording studio. And next week on May 11th, Krista Bentley and Miles Greer will be here to talk about their respective books in progress, Feeling Free, Politics in the Singer-Songwriter Movement in the United States, and a project about Joni Mitchell. And in case you're unaware, you can find the full 2021 schedule for Popular Music Books in Process events on the IASPM US website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, as well as previous recorded sessions on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have David Suisman and Joey Thompson here to talk about their respective in-progress books, War Notes, Music, Sound, and the Making of American Soldiers, and Cold War Country, Music Row, the Pentagon, and the Sound of American Patriotism. They will be in conversation with Lisa Gilman. David Suisman is the author of Selling Sounds, The Commercial Revolution in American Music, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2009, recipient of numerous awards and honors, and co-editor of Sound in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which was published in 2010, and described by one reviewer as, quote, multicultural historical analysis at its best, unquote. His articles have appeared in The Believer, Journal of American History, Social Text, Radical History Review, Journal of Social History, and other publications. He is associate and book review editor of the Journal of Popular Music Studies and a sometime disc jockey at freeform radio station WFMU. His day job is associate professor of history at the University of Delaware, where he specializes in cultural history, the history of music, sound studies, and the history of capitalism, and he lives in Philadelphia. Joey Thompson is an assistant professor of history at Mississippi State University. His first book, Cold War Country, Music Row, the Pentagon, and the Sound of American Patriotism, analyzes the economic and symbolic connections between the country music business and the military-industrial complex since World War II. He has published work in the journals Southern Cultures and American Quarterly, and contributed to the edited collections Eco-Criticism and the Future of Southern Studies, which was published by Louisiana State University Press in 2019, and Reconsidering Southern Labor History, Race, Class, and Power, published in 2018 by the University of Florida Press. And Lisa Gilman is professor of folklore at George Mason University. Her research interests include intangible cultural heritage, music, dance, cultural heritage, performance, trauma, war, gender, and sexuality in Southern Africa and the US. Her monographs include Folklore and Ethnomusicology Fieldwork Methods Handbook, with John Finn, published in 2019, My Music, My War, The Listening Habits of US Troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, published in 2016, The Dance of Politics, Performance, Gender, and Democratization in Malawi in 2009, and then co-edited volumes, Africa Ground, Local Perspectives on Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2015. And the co-edited volumes, Africa Every Day, Fun, Leisure, and Expressive Culture on the Continent in 2019, and UNESCO on the Ground, Local Perspectives on Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2015. She produced the documentary Grounds for Resistance in 2011 about the anti-war activism of US veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Eric will moderate. Please put your questions in the chat as they come to you, and Eric will find them there at the end of the discussion. Feel free to also post comments throughout the conversation. So I'll now turn things over to David, Joey, and Lisa.
All right, hi, welcome everybody, and thanks for inviting me. And I know a lot of you belong to the secret club, but it's a big deal to be allowed to, to speak and to be present. So thank you for that. We have to have a sense of humor about these things, right? We're little boxes that we exist in, and I exist within and across a lot of boxes. So I get confused about my identity when I'm in these spaces because of my rather eclectic interests and mix of projects that I've done. So I'm honored to be here today. And I'm looking forward to this conversation about music and war and music and military. So as Kim just said, I'm a professor of folklore, English, and public humanities at George Mason University. I will say that my identities span into ethnomusicology. So I consider myself to be, I'm very transdisciplinary, but certain ethnomusicology and folklore are my two biggest disciplinary anchors. So that gives me access to this club a little bit. So yeah, my work tends to, I'm an ethnographer by training. So my work tends to be on the ground with people, very contemporary topics. And a lot of my work has been on music and dance in relationship to different kinds of power, in different kind of power political contexts, and often specifically thinking about people on the ground and how they navigate their experiences and their worlds in relationship to power hierarchies and structural systems. So I was invited to participate in here because of my work with I'll plug my book, My Music, My War, that some of you may know about, that's about the listening. It's really focused on listening of different kind of musical listening by troops who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I also produced this film, Grounds for Resistance, which is not about music, but grew out of this project. And it's about the anti-war activism of US troops, people who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then subsequently became activists against war. And I'm gonna put a link to the film, not just to give myself a plug, but because it's only recently become accessible. I just posted it on YouTube. It's being distributed by an educational distributor, and then I have these DVDs that I sell, but nobody has DVD players anymore, so I decided to finally stream it. So it is now accessible. Feel free to watch it or share it with others as you find it interesting. So I thought I would just start the session off by giving a really broad overview of some of the ways that music intersects with military and war. And for those of you for whom you know a lot about this topic, just don't listen to me. But for those for whom you maybe haven't really thought a lot about music and war, I thought I'd kind of give us some idea. And I'll start off by saying that there's quite a lot of scholars who have been looking at music and war in different historical periods, but also in different contexts around the world. So this is a big topic that what we'll be talking about today is really grounded in the United States, but this is obviously a topic that can be looked at in all different locales and time periods. So music and war, music has been integrally tied to war and conflict from the get-go all across the world. And there's, we know about this from a lot of different sources. And so what are some of the ways that war and music are tied together? So music is often used as a tool or an instrument or an equipment in war. So music is used to organize troops, to train troops, to build bonding, to build cohesion, to build a sense of identity, to build a sense of patriotism, whether that patriotism is to a country or to whatever the entity is that the war is being fought, what the organizational structures are. It's used to signal, hey, let's start fighting and blow a bugle, or let's communicating across time and space. It's used to spread messages, to inculcate ideology, to disseminate propaganda. It's used in rituals. It's used in inductions, in graduations, in funerals. It's used to celebrate victories. It's used to mourn losses. And in our recent wars, we know that it's also being used in torture in very active ways. So all of these things happen both in kind of formal capacities and informal capacities, which are some of the ways that both Joey and David are going to be talking more about some of the formal capacities, but also going back and forth between the formal and informal. A lot of my work is more on the informal, like how people on the ground are using music as opposed to how the military is organizing music, or how countries are organizing music. Music during war is used for entertainment, as does everybody. People at war, they need to hang out and chat and relax, and music has a big role in that. And this again happens both at the informal level and the formal level. In the US context, you have formally organized events, you have musicians who are brought, who do tours and go into combat zones, you have radio programming that's targeted towards troops, you have concerts, you have, I know one of the people I interviewed was a pianist, and he played at religious services regularly while during his deployment. And then it happens more informally. People who are at war get together and they sing songs or play instruments, or more recently, a lot of the musical engagement happens through listening. They listen to music together or individually, and by together in a lot of different groupings of people, which is important to look at in terms of seeing what role it plays. Music is a big part of business. So Joey is going to talk a lot about the music industry and the country music industry specifically, and how it uses the military to create a market and to create a base and to create a sense of patriotism, which is a really good marketing act, right? If you can be the music of the nation and then get people to rally around and want to listen to that music as a way to belong to the nation or express their patriotism. You have musicians who are figuring out how to develop their own careers through the military. You can, getting into the military as a musician is a thing, or getting further training as a musician, or developing one's musical base and connections through the military or after. A lot of the people, not a lot, some of the people I interviewed have been creating music as vets for vets, and that's a whole sphere that exists. And then music has a huge role to play in identity making. And this has to do with when you're talking about national identity, or when you're talking about different groupings that are fighting for their own autonomy, or that are fighting for whatever reasons. Music has a way of being a way for, we all listen to the same music. So we are all rah, 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 we are one. In my work, I look at it much more on the ground in the way that, as with outside of the military and civilian life, we all have our different music, and you all are very good at this. I know as pop music scholars, you have you connect over what what music you like, and what records you have, what shows you went to, what t-shirts you're wearing, all of this. This also happens in the military, but in a much more heightened way, especially at war, because there's not a lot of other ways to identify and connect. You can't, if you're just kind of there, you don't have a lot of ways to express yourself. So music is one way, and then there's a lot of diversity within the military. So people identify and connect across various kinds of identifiers that are particularly important in the military, such as what branch you're in or what rank you're at. Gender is huge. Race, sexuality, class, region, what part of the country are you from? Religion, nationality, I think I already said that. And then music has a huge part to play in emotion. So this, again, is related to both the formal and the informal ways that music operates at war and with the military. Is then you can have the military actively using music to try to get people angry, or feel an emotional connection to the military, or feel really negative and hostile toward the enemy, or to try to get people to suppress grief or suppress vulnerability, or to really amp up certain kinds of like hyper-masculine, aggressive emotions or something. That also happens on an informal basis, and the troops use music, and whether it's singing songs and playing instruments or playing records, or depending on what historical moment it is, or now a lot of times by listening to music in order to get amped up if they're not feeling really up for what's coming, or to gain a sense of confidence, to kind of get into the mood for different kinds of activities they have to do. You have music that happens in clinics to help kind of soothe patients. I've talked to medics who use it individually as to help kind of as a form of therapy with their patients. And then you have people using it a lot for their own mood management, whether they're feeling angry and pissed off and need an outlet and a way to express that, or whether they're feeling sad, or whether they're feeling grief or ambivalence, and the different kinds of emotions that come up with that. Music can be a way to manage it in a positive way, but it also can be really negative, as people use music to amp up negative feelings that evoke trauma or hostility or aggression and various things. So it's kind of across the spectrum. So so again, there's tons and tons of material here, and which is great because we have a lot of scholars working at this stuff from different angles, and I've kind of just scratched the surface with this overview. But in terms of what we'll be talking about today, each of us in the work that we're doing, we do work that dovetails with a number of these different ways of these different intersections. So, so you'll see these themes emerge in Joey's and David's presentations, and then they'll continue to be discussed in our discussion and then in the Q&A. So, so as Kim said, we have David Suisman is going to talk about his book in progress, Armed with a Song, Music and the Waging of America's Wars. When he's done, Joey is going to talk about his book in progress, Country War, Cold War Country, Music Road, the Pentagon, and the Sound of American Patriotism. When they're done, we're going to have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So with that, I am going to hand it over to David.
Thank you, Lisa. That's great. And I just want to begin by thanking all the PopCon, JPMS, everybody, folks, the EASPM folks for organizing and inviting us to do this. And thanks for Lisa for moderating, and Joey for coming aboard as well. And a bunch of you I know and I haven't seen in a long time in person. And so it's really wonderful to see you virtually, and I hope we get to see you in person soon. So I wanted to do, in my brief time, I just wanted to do a couple of things. I wanted to start with a little fact that I learned, that I encountered in the course of my research a few years ago that really stuck with me. And this is that in 2015, the US Congress allocated $437 million for military music. This was about, this is almost 3 times the budget of the entire NEA. And I just couldn't, it took me a while to just sort of like let that sink in. And this really struck me for 2 reasons. One is that it just put the military's commitment to music in context, and sort of the context of the whole of the state, really. And it also indicated how much music's significance as a lubricant in the American war machine is not just a thing of the past. Since I've been researching this project, I've been astonished by how much music has been a part of war making, including both top-down music provided by the military as an institution, and also bottom-up musicking practices by soldiers. There's just music sort of all over. And so this budget statistic really indicated to me that this is a story that is both, it's not just a story of the past, but also one of the 21st century too. So what I want to do with my brief time here is I want to read just a couple of paragraphs from the introduction of my book. And then I want to show some pictures, because some of the stuff that I've encountered it made an impact on me when I read about it, but it made a much greater impact when I actually saw pictures. I was like, I couldn't quite get the magnitude of certain things until I saw them. So I thought I'd share some images with you. Okay, so this is from the introduction to my book. The United States military is, to a surprising extent, a musical institution. Today, it is the largest single employer of musicians in the world, with more than 6,000 instrumentalists in its ranks. In every major American war, the strains of music have coursed through military life, from induction ceremonies to funerals, from daily rituals to victory parades. Hallmarks of the military ethos, regularity, standardization, discipline, have all been inculcated through music. It's a quote. It is just as essential that soldiers should know how to sing as that they should carry rifles and learn how to shoot them, declared ex-Rough Rider and hero of the Indian Wars, General Leonard Wood in World War I. Sounds that soldiers have made and listened to have brought solace and comfort, kept boredom at bay, revived and elevated flagging spirits. Quote, It would be a dreary service indeed without music, and I don't believe the men could be kept together without it, a Union officer concluded in the Civil War. For both generals and soldiers, the sounds of music have been integral to modern America at war. Precious logistical resources have been dedicated to these sounds, which have conditioned combatants to commit acts of violence and cope with their consequences. Band concerts in the Civil War, group sings in World War I, and Armed Forces Radio in Vietnam helped American fighters manage the complex emotions war-making engendered. From the acute rage, fear, and guilt concomitant with paroxysms of killing and destroying, to the chronic homesickness and ennui of periods and places apart from the white-hot intensity of battle, these feelings were mediated by and expressed through song. Music enabled and empowered the nation's warriors to stand together and fight. By inquiring into the military's pursuit of these sounds, their implementation, and their effects on the fighters who made and heard them, we can discover a novel dimension of how soldiers waged war. As musical sounds offer insight into American war making, they shed new light on the military's relationship with society more broadly. If war and society are inextricably connected, and if the line between military and civilian is often blurred, then music is part of what bridges these binaries. Civilian musical culture flowed into the armed forces with inductees, and the military resounded with vernacular music. It was popular music, past and present, that soldiers sang and listened to, by and large, not patriotic anthems or bellicose war songs. In World War II, the GIs craved big band jive, not Kate Smith belting out God Bless America. John Philip Sousa wrote Stars and Stripes Forever, America's best known military march, and since 1987, the official national march of the United States, as a private citizen, though it quickly entered the repertoire of military bands. The fragile membrane that separated the music of the armed forces from civilian musical culture was always permeable from both directions. I'm going to stop there. Gives you just some sense of the scope or the breadth of the project. And then I want to just show you some stuff that's kind of fun. I want to start with I'm just going to show mostly Civil War. This is old stuff because as pop music scholars, I'm confident that a lot of you are much more familiar with late 20th century and 21st century stuff. So I'm going to go way back. In the Civil War, there were basically two kinds of military musicians. The first were field musicians who were drummers, buglers, and fife players. And their role was to direct soldiers when and where to be in battle, like when to advance or when to retreat or when to start firing and so forth. And so they were integral to the actual operations, the actual combat of the Civil War. And amazingly, the drummers were often these really young boys. And so I've just got a couple of pictures here. The one on the left, this is 12-year-old John Clem. And on the right, a 16-year-old named Andrew H. Johnson, who is the drummer of the 54th Massachusetts. And so I just, their youth really didn't register with me until I actually saw how young they looked in these Civil War portraits. But that's only part of the Civil War music. The other kind of music, the other kind of military musicians were called bands of music. And these were the regimental bands that came with soldiers from whatever state that they came from. And they played concerts every night to entertain soldiers, to keep their morale up. During the day, they doubled as stretcher bearers. In battle, they would help move out the wounded and so forth. But then soldiers had live music at camp every night. So this is a couple of pictures. This is the New York State Militia Band on the left. And on the right, this was a Confederate band called the 26th North Carolina Band. And of this band, after hearing them play once, Robert E. Lee is reported to have said, "I don't believe we can have an army without music." Okay, so a taste of the Civil War. Now the amount of music and the kinds of music get amped up in World War I. On the left, a picture of James Reese Europe's band, probably the best known band, at least today, of all the military bands in World War I. Of course, the famous band of the Harlem Hellfighters, and that was what I was familiar with going into this project. What was amazing to me was how much more music there was beyond that. More surprising than James Reese Europe's band was the amount of singing that went on. The U.S. Army soldiers were issued songbooks when they were inducted in World War I. First time in history that an army had given its soldiers songbooks as part of their equipment. And in training camps, they would participate in these what were called group sings, involving thousands and thousands of soldiers at once, led by a song leader, generally singing songs from this Army songbook, pop songs of the past or patriotic songs or whatever. So this picture on the lower right gives you a sense of what it was like to have all of these thousands of soldiers singing at once. It's a picture from the War Department. And the caption that the War Department gave it was, "Music and guns go hand in hand on the Western Front." You can see this guy, I don't know, I think you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? Yeah, you can see this guy's got a rifle here. This guy's armed with a saxophone. This guy's armed with a trombone, and so forth. And you get a sense of how integrated they were even overseas, not just in training camps. This is a poster from World War I that gives you a sense of how cognizant people would have been of the musical culture of the military. This is a poster essentially encouraging people to buy war bonds. But you see on the left, in the middle, there's the guy hurling this grenade. And then there's a bugler on the left, "Music makes for morale." And then on the right, of all things, you get these three doughboys. That was the nickname of US soldiers in World War I. You get these three doughboys sitting around a piano singing. This was a way of communicating to potential war bonds buyers about what life in the military was like. A singing army is a fighting army, is what one of the World War I generals said. And then there was the phonograph, which expanded and transformed the musical culture of the military in World War I. This is a picture from a military hospital, and we don't know what they're listening to, but if you look at their faces, it looks like they're quite taken with what they were listening to. But phonographs were all over. They were in the barracks. They were in these recreational facilities run by the YMCA, and they were even in the trenches. So they expanded the military culture, the musical culture of the military. They expanded what I think of as military musicking in new ways. Okay, so I don't have time to talk about World War II and beyond, but I just want to give you some sense of how where this goes over the course of the 20th century. In World War II, suffice it to say that the US military went to greater lengths to supply music to its personnel than any other fighting force in history. And they sent GIs song circulars every month, monthly song circulars with lyrics of pop songs, past and present, so that they could sing. This is a picture of this was called the Army Hit Kit, and then later in the Army and Navy Hit Kit. The US military sent small musical instruments for free to GIs. harmonicas, ocarinas, and these little recorders that were called tonettes, made of unbreakable plastic. The US military designed and manufactured and distributed these special phonographs, these field phonographs, and recorded a whole bunch of records specifically for GIs called V-discs that some of you, I imagine, are familiar with. And then maybe the biggest of all in World War II was the creation of the Armed Forces Radio Network. And that was a massive, complex undertaking, creating this worldwide network in a very short period of time that included not just programming, but also designing and manufacturing, distributing specially durable radios. And so on. So I just offer a few pictures here to give you some sense, and I could go on about World War II. There's a lot of stuff, but, and I didn't even mention the USO. And then, so this gives you some sense of the breadth of music in World War II. And then Joey's probably gonna talk more about the post-war period, but I just really was struck by this photograph of military musicking. This is a State Department, War Department, Department of Defense photo from Vietnam. So let me stop sharing and leave it at that. Hopefully I've given you a taste of what some of this stuff really consisted of. Thanks for listening. I look forward to our conversation. Joey.
All right, thank you, David. And thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. Thanks to Eric and Kim and everyone for having us. Just want to echo that for the thanks for IASPM and for the PopCon and all that for putting this on. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good? Okay, great. Well, so David gave you a kind of an overview of the breadth of music here, particularly as it functioned within the military. But I'm going to start with a proposition that's slightly different here and say that no genre of popular music holds a more recognizable link to the modern U.S. military than country music. Whether it's the Vietnam era jingoism of something like Merle Haggard's Fight Inside of Me, to the perennial appeal of Lee Greenwood and his nationalism heard in God Bless the USA, artists have turned support for militarism into a subgenre of country music. As we approach the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, we can think back to the way country fans could expect their favorite singers to comment on the attack and the subsequent war on terror. There's Alan Jackson's Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning, and the parenthetical Dixie Chicks, Traveling Soldier, which two songs that kind of offered moments of introspection about the meaning of patriotism. Others delivered the more perhaps predictable, belligerent macho swagger, most famously, of course, Toby Keith's Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, the Angry American. And that kind of Haggard to Greenwood to Keith genealogy offers a ready-made explanation about country music's politics. And it's true, we can use those songs to make a point about the silent majority's backlash to the anti-war movement during Vietnam and its legacies in 21st century hawkish conservatism and the kind of culture wars over that. Well, in this calculus, country music's support for the troops reflects some cultural predisposition that ties the genre's fan base to the politics of U.S. militarism. And it plays into the assumptions that it's white Southerners who make and listen to country music, even as we recognize the problems with that oversimplification. After all, those same Southerners join the military at rates disproportionate to their makeup of the general population. So, of course, country artists perform songs in support of the military and whichever politician makes national defense a part of their campaign rhetoric. Well, the book I'm working on, Cold War Country, challenges these assumptions about race, genre, and politics to explore and write what I hope is a deeper history that has tied together the support for U.S. militarism with country music. My work traces how the Pentagon and the country music industry we'll call it Music Row, created an economic relationship that benefited the growth of the genre's commercial power, while also encouraging the white fan base that Music Row actively and consciously cultivated to enlist in that Cold War military. I refer to this reciprocal relationship between the Defense Department and the genre as country music militarism. And this term just helps to describe the personal, economic, and symbolic connections between a genre usually associated in the popular imagination with white Southerners with the expansion of the Cold War defense state that delivered a financial boon to their region. So to chart this history, Cold War country forwards three main arguments that cover the development of the country music industry's connection to the Pentagon. So first, I show how the genre's entrepreneurs latched onto the expansion of the mid-century military as a way to help grow their businesses during the birth of the genre's industry. Beginning in the early 1950s, the Defense Department sponsored country music radio and television programs aimed at recruiting the music's predominantly white fan base. The first couple of chapters of the book examine the business connections established between the Defense Department and the country music industry and how those connections led to the birth of country music recruitment. And I do this through the story of a man named Connie B. Gay. He was a New Deal agricultural advisor who discovered the financial potentials of country radio in the post-war period. Most music scholars may know him as the founding president of the CMA, the Country Music Association. Well, he tapped into the economic potentials of joining forces with the Defense Department and pioneered the use of country music programming as both entertainment and recruitment. And next, I used the story of Farron Young, an eventual Country Music Hall of Famer, to develop this story of Cold War recruitment. The Army drafted Farron Young in 1952, and he spent most of his time in the military making recruitment and entertainment appearances both in person and on radio and television, even from the stage of the Ryman Auditorium, where he would be a part of the cast of the Grand Ole Opry. And all of this in turn led to more country music recruitment because it was actually working, kind of creating a pipeline of country music fans to the military. Now, this relationship also gave Music Row a promotional partner to sell their products and created a distribution network to expand their audiences around the globe. The Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, David referenced earlier, aired thousands of hours of country music programs for military and foreign civilian listeners during the Cold War. And this gave Nashville's artists a free promotional outlet to push their records. Additionally, there's a global network of military installations after World War II maintained by the U.S. Armed Forces. And these acted as kind of a pre-made tour circuit for a lot of country artists. These installations also housed post-exchange stores, or PX stores, where record companies could sell their products to service members who were in need of entertainment. They started selling records in 1947. And as soldiers steadily increased the number of country music records they bought over the 1950s and 60s, to the point that by 1968, the European PXs sold more country records than any other genre. Something like 65% of the records sold in the PXs in Europe were country records, and that was around $4 million in 1968, which I think is over $30 million in today's money. Okay, so that's the first big argument. It's about building those business connections. Second, I argue that country music militarism helped white Southerners see the expansion of the military as a part of their regional culture rather than an intrusion of state power into their everyday lives. So in other words, country music provided the kind of populist cover for white Southerners who joined the nation's largest bureaucracy and received government benefits in return for that service. Now, as those white Southerners joined the military, they began to request more country music on Armed Forces Radio, and some began using the Armed Forces as a space to explore their own talents for playing the music. dozens of country musicians, including future stars like Farron Young, who I already mentioned, Johnny Cash, perhaps most famously, Tom T. Hall, Mel Tillis, Stonewall Jackson. I mean, the list goes on and on. All of these artists use their time in the ranks to hone their craft, often discovering their talents there for the first time. Now, many of these men took advantage of the Armed Forces Special Services, which was the division in charge of troop morale and entertainment, and used that as a springboard into a civilian music career once they left the military. Then I also spent a couple of chapters dealing with rockabilly, because you can't write a book like this without talking about Elvis. And here I argue that the U.S. military's interracial and homosocial spaces functioned as incubators of creativity for the aspiring country musicians, later branded as rockabillys, who briefly pushed the sounds of blackness to the forefront of country music. So in this sense, armed service helped give birth to the biggest existential threat that Music Row would face in the 1950s. Of course, the great exception to that story is Elvis Presley, who didn't serve until after he was famous. But with Elvis, the military delivered another benefit to country music by actually removing this threat to the meaning of country music during his time in the service from 1958 to 1960. So my third major argument asserts that Music Row aligned with political conservatism during the Vietnam War, not because of some inherent ideology within its artists and fans, but because of these lucrative partnerships it had established with the Pentagon in the 1950s. Now, the expansion of the defense state had enjoyed bipartisan support during most of the Cold War, but as debates over Vietnam fractured that consensus, conservatives claimed the mantle of America's most steadfast supporters of the military in the aftermath of the war, and in the process painted those on the left as something less than patriotic. Well, Music Row's support for the armed forces turned country music into a soundtrack for those voters and politicians, often but not always Republicans, a lot of conservative Southern Democrats too, people who supported those hawkish foreign policies. Those policies, in turn, assured a demand for more soldiers. The Pentagon then used more country music in its recruitment and entertainment strategies, and the cycle continued. Now, I'm using this third argument to take the narrative through the 1980s into Operation Desert Storm. And in doing so, I'm hoping to understand how and why the country music industry maintained its ties to the armed forces, even as the Pentagon moved away from using it as a recruitment tool in the 80s and 90s, and as the ranks of the U.S. military grew in diversity after the move to an all-volunteer force. Now, my concentration on country music isn't meant to obscure the way artists from other genres intersected with the U.S. government's Cold War missions. The Pentagon, obviously not just interested in country music fans, they're interested in recruiting as many people as possible. So they use pop music a lot to achieve its recruiting goals. Meanwhile, the State Department famously used African-American jazz artists to combat communist propaganda about white supremacy and a capitalist nation. Well, I pivot to those stories from other genres throughout Cold War country to offer points of comparison. That often means showing the way military officials foreclosed opportunities for Black artists who did not fit the notion of a proper morale-building entertainment for the troops. But I focus primarily on country music because no other genre used the military to build its business the way that Music Row did. So just as Defense Department spending laid the foundation of the U.S. South's post-war industrial economy, it also helped create one of the region's most recognizable cultural economies. So I'll look forward to hearing from everybody in the Q&A, and thanks again for having me here.
Well, thank you, David and Joey. We have like 30 minutes. Do we want to just open up the Q&A, or should we tackle some of the themes that we came up with?
Questions that you wanted to ask.
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and do that. It's okay if we go a couple minutes later. Usually when we have presenters representing two different books, we understand that the thing might go a little longer.
Okay. Well, there's so much to talk about here. So I'm going to kind of tackle the race one, just because I think we need to talk about race as much as possible. And so I was wondering if you could each, Joey, you just talked about it, but maybe develop it a little bit more and think about how the military, on the one hand, is the one American institution that integrated, the first institution that really integrated and really provided opportunities for especially Black citizens or Black people to gain access to education and officer positions, and a lot of different training and economic opportunities through the military, and a lot more integration in terms of social integration, in terms of living spaces and workspaces, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this tension between the military as this place that is multiracial and for some time has been kind of forefronting itself with that, versus the very explicit use of musics that definitely feed into a very dominant center of whiteness. And maybe from each of your perspectives, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the military officially was supposed to begin integration in 1948, of course, after President Truman's executive order, but doesn't really start happening in any kind of practical way until it actually has to during the Korean War. It was mobilization for that. And that's one of the kind of key ironies that I've been writing about is what does it mean that the recruitment service would want to invest so much in a genre like country music at a time that it's integrating its ranks? Well, to me, that says, of course, they want able-bodied people. So there is a kind of casting a wide net through using pop music, but to invest so heavily in a genre like country music, I think just reflects perhaps a preference. So they may not say that in official policy, but we can look at the way that country music recruitment functioned and actually worked as evidence that they were interested not just in having anyone in uniform, but perhaps a preference for white recruits, at least during the at least up until the move to an all-volunteer force.
Thanks for a great question. I think I would come at this sort of looking at two different moments. And one of them was, first one's World War I, when music was used it was one of the goals for music for the military in World War I was to Americanize and to homogenize its fighting force. About a fifth of American soldiers were foreign born in World War I. And among African American troops, they distinguished themselves. The African American bands totally distinguished themselves and elevated. They really like raised the bar for military music in World War I. So that gave them this visibility and this mobility in the military that created opportunities for them that they wouldn't have otherwise. But as far as the experience of African-American soldiers who weren't musicians, let's say, there's also insight that we can find through the songs that they sang more informally. And there's this pretty interesting songbook, a collection of songs that was put together by John Jacob Niles, who you may know as the composer and song collector. He was also a World War I vet. And in the 1920s, he put together two compilations of songs. One of them was called Songs My Mother Didn't Sing for Me, or something like that. And he has a few songs in there that he identifies as specifically sung by African Americans, and they have this hint of them. I mean, he was not particularly interested in this question, but in the the lyrics that he transcribes in these songs, you can hear this tension. You can hear them not sort of wondering what they're doing there in the military when they are being mistreated in American society writ large. And you can sort of hear the way that music was used to express that sort of ambivalence about serving the country, serving the country at a time when their rights were so constrained. The other moment that I would sort of look at that I think is so interesting is the war in Vietnam, when music became such a social identifier. People used it, it was so much a part of people's identities. And from stuff that I've read, there would be disputes or fights that would break out in bars or nightclubs or whatever recreational spaces between, say, the country fans, the Johnny Cash fans, and the James Brown fans. And these were different, political, cultural identities, and they would clash, and they would be manifested through these conflicts over music.
That's absolutely right, David. That Vietnam anecdote, soldiers would kind of claim space using sound. So as far as you could hear the radio, that kind of demarcated a country music zone. If you could hear the country music, then that was their area, right? So it's kind of like turf wars in that sense. And you bringing up James Brown reminded me of something I came across in my research, which was a letter that James Brown wrote to Lyndon Johnson after touring Vietnam, and felt that he had been mistreated and wasn't given the proper respect that he deserved as a touring musician, and calling attention to his own patriotism and saying, "Am I not an American? Do I not deserve the kind of recognition that these other artists that I know are receiving?" So it's not just the soldiers who are intersecting and are African American soldiers who are finding opportunities foreclosed for themselves within the military, but it's even popular entertainers as they try to entertain the troops in these war situations.
So I add an anecdote from my own research about this, like turf wars. One story that one of my interviewees shared with me, he was white, and he said he was in a small unit, and had both black and white members, and they were all sleeping in one space, but they put their cots on opposite sides of the space. So the blacks were on one side and the whites were on the other side. And then they had, but they didn't really talk about it. It was just kind of happened. And then there would be these kind of sonic wars where like the black troops would put on their music, and the white ones would be like, can you turn that down? And so they'd crank it up, and then they'd crank theirs up, and they'd crank theirs up. And it sounded like from the person I interviewed that they typically lost. And so it's kind of interesting in spaces where you certainly have a lot of white privilege and supremacy, but sonically, in that particular context, the black soldiers won out. And so the power, the navigations of power are very nuanced and complex. And I don't think they ever talked about it, right? But they would fight together and work together as a solid unit with cohesion at the same time. Just across our work, I keep going back. My brain keeps tackling this idea of David's work with kind of the organized music for the troops. Joey, you're really thinking with the music industry and the artists, and then me with like the people on the ground listening to music. And so we have these very different, we're telling, between the three of us, we're telling a whole story that needs all three parts. So it's really interesting to think about any question with all of those different pieces. I think one thing we could maybe spend a little bit of time talking about is technology, because that's just a huge piece of this puzzle in terms of thinking about how what music is even available for anybody to use in any way has so much to do with what's going on with technology and just the massive shifts in technology since with David's work from the Civil War on up, or up until the 80s through the present and so forth. And so maybe each of you could just talk a little bit about technology as it relates to your work.
I think it's such an interesting question because I think it really is a way of thinking about consumer choice and thinking about the flexibility that people had in what they listened to. In the Civil War, there was music, there were bands that played at night, but you listened to what the band played. You didn't have any, much input on that. In World War I, you start to get records. And so soldiers would have they'd have a few records maybe, they're fragile, of course. So some broke. You'd have some choice, some flexibility about what you were listening to. You could exercise some agency over the sounds of your environment. And then in World War II, it expands even more. You have the radio, and American Armed Forces Radio was really diverse in its programming. They had weekly shows, they had daily shows. They tried to be very inclusive. But then by the time you get to Vietnam and later, you start to see how technology plays into American consumer choice, the prerogatives of American consumer choice, that soldiers who were buying records at the PX that Joey was talking about had barracks where they could listen to whatever they wanted to, and they didn't have to listen to everybody else. This is apart from the stuff that was going on in the bars and nightclubs and stuff, but a lot of them had barracks apart where they could listen to records and exercise more choice. But anyway, the arc of it ends up in the 21st century when people can listen with earbuds and headphones and really finely calibrate the music that they're listening to. So you could have in one barracks, you could have somebody who's listening to like really heavy music to get amped up for going out on patrol, right next to somebody who's listening to some really chill singer-songwriter because they've just come back from patrol and they're trying to relax. And so technology is part of that emotional, is really a tool of emotional management in that respect. So I'll say that, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think David's totally right about the consumer choice aspect, because the time period that I'm primarily writing about, 50s, 60s, and 70s, soldiers are still largely reliant on armed forces radio, and by 53 also television services integrated in there, and so they're kind of, whatever is on the radio is what you listen to. And we're without headphones at this point. So to actually tie it back to the previous question, I've come across these kinds of turf wars as well over taste preferences within the barracks, and people complaining so much about country music and writing letters to the editor of soldier newspapers and magazines saying, I came to Europe and hoped I could get away from all that hillbilly racket I heard during basic training when I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, where we were drowning in hillbilly music. And now here I come to Germany and I'm drowning in it again. And hillbilly fans writing back and saying, oh, these jazz fans and these pop fans are so snooty and so snobby, they're looking down on us. So I bring this up to say that the radio was so instrumental in allowing soldiers to kind of claim a space for themselves by whatever the programming was on. So they identified with the DJ strongly. They would identify with whatever show was on, very strongly, particularly for these country fans that I'm studying. And again to tie it to the record sales, by the late 50s, the country music industry is starting to get clued in to just how important this market can be, and how lucrative this market can be. So they are very forceful in putting some of their top DJs into the Armed Forces radio. So Joe Allison, who we might know as one of the pioneers of format radio. Everyone's read Eric's book, right? One of the pioneers of format radio for country anyways. He had a radio show on Armed Forces Network all through the 60s called Country Corner. And he would be on the radio sometimes twice a day in some markets in the Pacific, spinning country music. Well, that's not just for the benefit of the soldiers. They knew that if they had Joe Allison spinning the latest hits from Nashville, then those people would then go to the PX and buy that record. And so that's the way you see that those record sales grow. So I think that's where the technology comes in for me, is that the technology is just a medium for soldiers' dollars to get back to the record labels.
Thanks. So I have one thing too, is there's more music playing, right? There, when there was less control over what you could listen to, there was more, I think, people hanging around singing, or people would talk about like sneaking guitars to Vietnam and getting together and playing music.
Can I add one more thing too?
Yeah.
And that for context, it's really important to recognize that there's this shift that takes place in the ratio of combat to non-combat soldiers. So that until the war in Vietnam, you had a majority of soldiers in the military were combat soldiers, and then you had the minority were non-combat support troops. And that ratio flips in Vietnam, so that it's about 3 non-combat troops to every combat troops, to every combat soldier in Vietnam. So you have a lot more people who are just not in combat. They have more time to listen to music, essentially. So it's part of the context of technology. So
really interesting. I didn't realize that. All right, well, we could continue this forever, but we're going to turn it over now and let Eric moderate some questions from the rest of you all. So thanks, everybody, and we'll wait for your questions.
Thank you, Lisa. We have a bunch of great questions. I'll put up one quick show and tell item. This is Men of Popular Music, the Armed Services Edition, built small in World War II so soldiers could take it with them into service, whether as combatants or non-combatants, I'm not sure. But anyway, little souvenir. Gail, would you like to ask the first question?
Sure, and I hate to take up time. This has been such a great conversation, and there's so many great comments and questions. I don't know if either of you, any of you, want to speak to the question of how or whether the U.S. military has been a kind of agent of the U.S. popular music industry globally, in terms of kind of outposts, either for radio or for that kind of thing. So in other words, kind of in some ways a tool of the dissemination of popular music because of the power of the U.S. military globally.
Yeah, well, there are 2 different radio systems that are operating concurrently. There's Armed Forces Radio, and then you also have the VOA, which isn't military, but the Voice of America was also the state, projecting American music all around the world. But in terms of Armed Forces Radio, it was made for soldiers, but there would, of course, be locals around any military base who would be listening. And they were known as eavesdroppers. And and there are some famous eavesdroppers, like Brian Eno says that living near a military base, he listened to and learned a lot about American music from AFRS, from American Armed Forces Radio, as did like the composer Toru Takemitsu in Japan. So there are definitely lines of influence that can be traced out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for my genre here for country music, I mean, it's Armed Forces Radio. That influence cannot be understated. It's why there's such a well, I won't say it's 100% why, but there's a large reason why there's such an audience for country music in places like Germany and Japan. Mari Nagatomi's recent article actually kind of complicates that and says there was country music in Japan way before the Americans showed up. But I think that sustained interest in country music is in part not only because of the radio influence on those populations, but also because you had bars opening up where American musicians, soldiers would go and actually play. So there's not just not just kind of the passive listening, but also actually Americans going out and playing that music.
Lisa, did you want to? No, okay. All right, Stacy.
So I've been doing this for a year, and I'm so not used to the muting, unmuting problem. I was just curious about the sort of connections to USO in relationship to the some of the things that Gail was talking about.
So the role of the USO.
The USO was so big. They in World War II. I mean, their combined audience of all of the shows. If you add up the audience of all of the shows that USO performers, who were like the famous performers, and then they're also like mid-level and people and has-beens, all perform USO shows for the troops. The combined audience over the 4 active years of the war was about 212 million people. 212 million audience members. It's enormous. So it totally complements all these other musical activities. It was going on. And World War II is obviously the most famous association for most people with the USO, but it also continued in Vietnam, was very extensive there. And maybe Joey wants to say more about that.
Yeah, sure. So David kind of mentioned these kind of high points for the USO. What's important for my story is that by the early 50s, there's not a lot of funding for the USO. And so that actually creates an opportunity for some of my country music entrepreneurs to book their own tours to these military bases and even the front lines of Korea. The guy I mentioned early in the talk, Connie B. Gay, actually kind of cements his connection to the Defense Department because he books Grandpa Jones on a tour of the front lines of Korea. And he's going kind of, the way he tells it anyways, hopping foxhole to foxhole, entertaining soldiers, and as well as putting on the kind of flatbed truck concerts that you might picture Bob Hope or someone like that doing. What's interesting about country music in this respect, though, is because of the portability of its instrumentation, they could actually be a little more agile in their movements. Which benefited them. So you didn't have to have a piano player necessarily, or some kind of entourage or backing singers or dancers. You could have Grandpa Jones with his banjo going around, and it actually facilitated. It was kind of this convergence of an opening for these entrepreneurs because of a lull in the USO, and then that complemented with the instrumentality of country music.
And I would say in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, at least from the people that I talked to, not very many people had the opportunity to see any of the musicians or the shows that would come. There were shows that come, but because, as David was saying, there's so many people are in combat roles and they're spread out a lot in makeshift camps, or a lot are moving, they're sleeping in, especially in Afghanistan, they're like, in these little outposts and stuff. And so, some people would talk about like they would have these moments where they would be on these, on bases where they had good access to Wi-Fi, and there were these entertainment nights and dance nights, and there would be artists that would come through. But, it was like maybe like they'd gone to 1 or 2 shows. Like it was pretty limited. And it seemed like the ones who would go, they would go to whatever music was there because it was interesting to see an artist. And if it was a female artist, that was awesome. And so it wasn't nearly, I don't think it was shaping their listening nearly as much as in the time period that you all are talking about.
It's a long story. Jeff Melnick.
Hey, thanks all for totally fantastic discussion. I was just sort of thinking about David's book, Selling Sounds, and wondering how much rationalization there was their efforts at rationalization by the music industry to kind of capture the military market. Like, are there particular phonograph machines that are being sold as like good for the soldier, or could people on the home front like have easy ways of sending music to their people overseas? And I'm interested in this with Joseph's presentation also. Like, are there ways that the music industry is sort of noticing the military as a really important sort of selling zone? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Nice to see you, Jeff. The rationalization in terms of the music industry is in World War I. I mean, it's really Tin Pan Alley that gets so on board with patriotic songs, but they also are licensing their songs for free to these like U.S. songbooks that are issued to soldiers. They're licensing their songs for free, the publishing houses, as they do in World War II, when the music publishers are allowing the reproduction of their lyrics in these monthly song circulars for free. So they're recognizing that they want to keep, in World War II, for example, that they want to keep the 16 million people who serve in the US military in World War II connected to contemporary popular culture, to the contemporary music scene. They have an investment in keeping those, keeping soldiers abreast of like new hits and that kind of thing. The development of technology, I think it's a really big question, but the military sort of takes the lead in developing that stuff, but they're doing it drawing on talent from the record industry and from the phonograph industry. People who go to work for the military to do this stuff are being plucked out of private industry.
Yeah, Nashville is absolutely 100% aware of what's going on, particularly by the 1960s. It takes them a little while to catch on, but definitely by the 1960s, they're aware that this is a market that they should cultivate. In fact, during Vietnam, they one of the Music Row actors, Bill Williams, had put together a compilation of country music songs, patriotic country music songs, and shipped it over to Vietnam, and went with it to hand out these discs as kind of promotion, and it cut across all the a lot of the major record labels in country music: Mercury, Star Day. I'm forgetting how many of them were represented on this compilation, but he goes out and starts handing it out and saying, you know, essentially, Nashville's here for you, and here's a free record to prove it. So yeah, they're absolutely kind of seeding these fields, or seeding these markets, essentially. Yeah.
Maya.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm out hiking, but thanks so much for this really awesome conversation. I know very little about this, but coming from a French studies perspective, it made me think about Black GIs who served for the American military or fought for the French in World War I and then stayed on after, such as Eugene Bullard, who performed in France. And so I was wondering if there are other instances in your research where you see soldiers staying on in the places where they were fighting and starting musical careers there. So that was my first question. My second question that came up in the conversation you were having is thinking about Cajuns, because they were Americanized mainly through the military in World War II. And so I was curious if you have any research on Cajun music in the military. Thanks.
Great questions. I don't have a lot of examples of Black GIs or Black doughboys in World War I who were staying on yet. I think some of them did, and they were, responded to the huge appeal that jazz was generating in Europe. But I think also a lot of them were eager to try to build careers at home, despite the conditions at home. I think so I haven't found the stories that you're asking about that I would like to find, because I think that would be great. Cajun music, I'll keep my ears open for it. I don't have examples of that.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. So I don't have examples of African-American soldiers staying on in places. What I do find in my work and write about are the ways in which African Americans artists try to use their time in the military as kind of well, I keep saying this, but as a springboard into civilian success, right? So one of the people I write about is an artist named Cecil Gant. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he billed himself as Private Cecil Gant. His first record he cut was called I Wonder, #1 hit, 1944. amazing song. He's from Tennessee, from a town just outside of Nashville. He's drafted into the military, records this song while he's in the military, and starts touring. And this is not in an official Army capacity in any way, but he starts touring and performing with his uniform on and billing himself as the GI Sensation, Private Cecil Gant. Unfortunately for him, he could not then kind of parlay that into a big civilian career. He did continue making records after the war, and in fact was one of the top selling artists for Bullet Records, which was the first record label in Nashville, Tennessee. And what I argue, he essentially builds Bullet Records, and then they kind of cast him off to the side. It's not a pleasant story. The other story that comes to mind in that regard is an artist that I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with, O.B. McClinton, who was an African-American country singer, put out his first records, I think, in '73 on Enterprise Records. It was a subsidiary of Stax. But he bills himself as a country singer. Well, he discovers his talent for singing country music while serving in the Air Force in Okinawa. Right at the time that Charlie Pride hits, he starts singing in the service clubs over in Okinawa, and then uses that side of his career as a way to sort of prove his country music bona fides, to say, I'm a veteran. I know what it means to serve your country, and he tried to use that to help his civilian career with mixed results. But he's a great artist. Both of those were great artists. But that's as close as I come. Sorry, that's not really what you wanted to hear. But oh yeah. And in terms of your question about Cajun music. I don't really write about Cajun stuff, but I would refer you to Jessica Dautrieve, who is a PhD student in history at George Mason University. She's writing a dissertation about the Americanization of Cajuns, and writes about World War II and Armed Forces Radio specifically. So,
damn, there with the handy citation. Awesome. Yeah. Carl, I think you're up next.
Oh my goodness, this is such a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Carl Miller. I should have said it was Carl Wilson up.
Oh, Carl Wilson. Okay.
You're on the list.
I'm in the queue.
A couple more. Hold on. Don't. My bad.
I'm going to make this real quick so that people like other Carl can join in. But I really appreciate, Joey, the way that you're kind of balancing out the picture that we have of music in the military with country, because we have these cliched ideas of, swing in the 30s and 40s and rock and soul in the 60s, and then like rap and metal in the sort of Gulf Wars. But I wondered, just for some balance to the picture you're giving, how much other sort of genre niche labels and things have done any of the kind of work that you are talking about Nashville doing in those periods, Motown in the 60s, for example. I was wondering about whether they ever tried to take advantage of the military market in these ways.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for that, Carl. It's a great question, and it's one that wakes me up in the middle of the night as I'm writing this. Like, what am I leaving out? And I just haven't found the evidence for that. If there's someone that can point me that way, I would love to know. But the only kind of, this is not really, I don't think what you have in mind, but the only thing that I have that is even close to that is the way that people who worked in the front office of Stax Records would send things to the Stax artists who were stationed in Vietnam. So they would send kind of care packages and stuff. Now, I imagine that goes a little ways in terms of promoting the music itself, but I don't have any. In fact, that's what kind of sustains me as I'm writing this, is to say I can't find anyone else doing this but country music people. So hopefully I'm right. And if I'm not, someone please chime in and tell me, because it's a great question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
No, that is an answer. How about John Troutman?
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, John.
I'll just speak briefly to get out of the way of the other Carl, so he can ask his question. But
for everybody.
Just a couple of things real quickly. The question about Black artists staying after service in World War I. I'm wondering if, I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm wondering if Vance Lowry, the banjoist, got to Europe through service with the military, because he played with James Reese Europe after that in Europe and stayed there, I think, until World War II. So I don't know if he arrived during the war or if he arrived in Europe before them. That's just that's one idea. But otherwise, Jeff had already kind of raised essentially my question, which was I was interested in this relationship between this explosion of pop Tin Pan Alley music related to World War I and, with the military and the war effort itself. And so, David, I don't know if if your project kind of encompasses, in greater detail that relationship between the World War I song canon coming out of Tin Pan Alley and the military's own plans for music, or even how popular that music was. But there were all these sentimental songs to mothers and all sorts of anti-German songs and other things that popped up in Tin Pan Alley at that point. So.
First question, I have no idea. I'll find out. I'll look into that. The second one about Tin Pan Alley, there was one of the things is that Tin Pan Alley was turning out a lot of war songs. I don't think that's what most of the soldiers were that interested in. They were interested in, singing about other stuff. They were familiar with the war, and so they didn't have to sing about it. But they were interested in Tin Pan Alley, and the songs that the Tin Pan Alley was turning out, they sang enthusiastically, and they were interested in the new songs that were coming out. One of the things that's interesting about this, though, your question raises, John, is that in World War II, Tin Pan Alley still exists, but it doesn't have the same. It's not tapped into the sort of spirit of the contemporary music world in the same way. And they are trying desperately in World War II to come up with some really catchy war songs that will really take off. And the military is working with them. They're trying really hard, and they can't come up with a big wartime hit like Over There, George M. Cohan's Over There was in World War I. They're struggling for it. So I'll leave it at that.
Interesting. There might be room for some Tin Pan Alley into Nashville connection to be made. Carl Miller, your turn has arrived. I'm so sorry.
I'm the other Carl. Yeah, my question's kind of been answered a little bit, but I want to ask David and Joey a little bit about expanding beyond genre and beyond. I'm struck by students today who are experiencing Spotify, which is interested in selling music, but not selling any particular brand of music. Their algorithm is creating fans of music writ large, and Joey, particularly yours, is focused on a particular genre. So and David's recent answer to the Ward songs question raises this as well in terms of, do you think the military is interested in particularly genres of music, or are we interested in just a kind of continuity across genre? How are they thinking about the industry? Were they thinking about it in terms of separate genres and separate constituencies, or were they just interested writ large in thinking about music as a propaganda tool to create support?
Well, I'm going to cop out and say both of those things.
It's the historian's answer. That's a great answer.
Yeah. Punt to both. So yeah, I mean, they are certainly interested in, well, I think one feeds into the other, actually. So they're interested in casting the widest net possible. But if the fishing is good over here in country music, then we'll put a little more effort into that. That's what's biting today, so we're going to put more effort into that, and then they move on if they need to. What's interesting is that I guess from my perspective is that I don't see any other corner of the music industry, so no other genre, in other words, latching on to this opportunity the way that country music did. Is that enough?
That's plenty, man.
Carl, I'll respond to your question by thinking about World War II and Armed Forces Radio, which had quite diverse programming. They had like a daily pop show, and they had a daily country show, I think, actually. But then there was like all these other genres that they would have like weekly shows of, or a couple times a week. So they were interested. The Armed Forces Radio had basically two purposes. One is it was to entertain and inform soldiers, and so they really did not care. They just wanted people to listen. The other thing is they wanted people to listen so that they would hear public service announcements. And they, the management of Armed Forces Radio was very explicit about trying to use whatever musical options were available to them, so that soldiers like in the Pacific would get these PSAs that said, take your Atabrine. That was the anti-malarial medication. That's what they were concerned with. And so it was the PSAs that were the point. And whatever programming would keep people tuning in, they were for it.
Man, I think that's really brilliant. I just wanted to say, both of those answers are great. And I just want to remind that the music business is constantly ignorant about popular taste. And so they're constantly trying to chase it, right? And so for the military to be constantly trying to chase this and come up with anything that might hit, I think is important to remember that they were kind of shooting in the dark. Yeah, I totally appreciate both of these talks. Thank you very much.
I would just add a little bit to that, which is that in the research that I did, one of the things I came across is that in news stories, in the media stories about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you'd hear this kind of mono narrative about the troops are listening to heavy metal and that's getting them all revved up, and then they're going out and killing, or patriotism and country music and what I found in doing my research is kind of exactly what you're saying, Carl, is that people listen to all sorts of stuff, right? I mean, and across the board, and people are like, well, sometimes I'm listening to a classical song, and sometimes it's electronic, and sometimes I'm listening to reggae, and just completely out of the box and very, the genres of the were in the media were certainly prominent, but they were not, that did not explain what troops really do. So I think that you're absolutely right, and so it's a very good point.